Hi, today we're going to be talking about PPE or personal protective equipment. And most of you know, excuse me, what it is or have used it in the past, but let's go into some detail with regard to this. Just first for some statistics, with regard to head injuries, those that actually had head injuries, only 16% were actually wearing hard hats. And you can see the major injuries that could happen with regard to injuries of the head. Only 7%, excuse me, 1% of approximately 700 workers that were actually had some type of face injury were wearing face protection, which isn't very much at all. And only 23% of workers with foot injuries were wearing any type of safety shoe or safety boot. About 40% of the workers with eye injuries wore some type of eye protection. So this can be found in general industry under 1910, 132 through 138, construction 1926, 95 through 106. Today we're going to focus mainly on some of the major PPE that's out there. I'm going to do this very hierarchy, so it's not going to be in detail or anything. We could do a whole hour just on respiratory or head protection or something like that, but we're going to try to fit this in and run through this so that you can get the gist pretty much of the PPE standard. So the employer does have responsibilities, and essentially we have to look at what is going on within our facilities and pick which type of PPE is best for our employees to use. We also have to make sure that we're telling employees with regard to what we've decided to use, and we have to make sure that the PPE fits the employees. So we can't just get one size fits all. We're going to have to get something that fits everyone in the facility. Also, too, we have where we have to do a job safety analysis, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But essentially, it goes through what we're looking at, the area. Then also, too, we're going to assign it to make sure that it is certified. It's some type of certification, the date, and then also when we look at this, this is a document that can typically be used in any type of lawsuit. Or something like that. So we need to make sure that we're doing this throughout our facility. Now, there is a booklet that's out there on job hazard analysis, and we're not going to go over that, but a hazard assessment does need to be done. And essentially, like I said earlier, it pretty much looks at what hazards are present, what we decided we're going to utilize with regard to PPE in our facility. And another place that we can look to maybe choose some of that PPE is looking at equipment with regard to what the manufacturer states that we possibly or potentially could use, any of our SDSs or MSDSs with regard to chemicals, and then also too like previous hazard assessment forms, and so those can be used, and those do need to be updated as changes are made. So we do need to not just do those once and put it on a shelf. We need to make sure that we're doing those continuously. Now, the control methods with regard to OSHA are as above. The first one's going to be elimination or substitution, which is pretty much under engineering controls. Essentially, with regard to that, it shows that we have done something to change the workplace. And so this is going to eliminate, it's going to substitute any type of hazard that may be out there. And we want to make sure that the hazard doesn't even come in contact with the employee. Here in a minute, I'll give you some examples of engineering controls. Administrative controls, this has to do with the management and the worker has to do something. So one of them has to do something, or both of them have to do something with regard to that. And then the last one is going to be PPE, and this essentially requires the worker to actually wear something, wear it properly. So you can see why this might be the least effective, mainly because we're depending on the employee to do what we tell them to do and to do it properly. So we can see here that the most effective is going to be engineering controls, and the least effective is going to be PPE when we look at it. Sorry, I'd never used that little pen thing, so I wanted to make sure I was looking at it. So when we look at engineering controls, these are just some examples. If we put a guard up that there is no way that the employee can remove or something like that, that would probably end up being an engineering control. So we're enclosing or isolating any type of process that's having to do with the machine. We can have some ventilation. Obviously, when we purchase machines, if we purchase them with machine guards and that type of thing, those are design specs, and so those are built in. But the substitution to a less harmful material and elimination, ventilation, those are going to be our best bets with regard to keeping our employees safe. When we look at administrative controls, a lot of things with regard to administrative controls, wet methods, personal hygiene, and when I talk about that is just like, keeping wounds closed, possibly not having drinks on the floor, that type of thing. Housekeeping, maintenance, rotation of workers, so shifts, any type of rotation, breaks, training would be up underneath administrative controls, policies, procedures, programs, all of those would be administrative controls. And so once again, with administrative controls, the worker has to do something and the management has to do something, so there's action through both of those. So when we start looking at trying to protect employees from hazards, we first have to do engineering controls, and that's required from OSHA. And then we look at administrative controls. So if we don't have the availability to do either of those, or we're going to do one of those in conjunction with PPE, then that would be okay. So PPE is the last level of control. It's our final thing that we want to use. Most companies will say, yes, it costs a lot less, and so let's go ahead and use the PPE. But if OSHA does come in, they'll ask you to see a hazard analysis and ask you why you didn't implement any engineering controls or administrative controls when we look at it. So payment for PPE, and I'll attach a in the module, I'll put something in there with regard to payment for PPE, which goes over it fairly thoroughly. But when we look at it, we do have to provide PPE to our employees and at no cost. Now, there are some exceptions, and although some companies do go ahead and pay for this, they're not required to pay for those. And some of those include the safety toe footwear, prescription safety eyewear, weather-related gear, logging boots, those types of things. So do check out that attachment that is going to be in modules, and it'll kind of list everything out for you with regard to payment for PPE and what doesn't necessarily have to be paid for by the employer. So when we have any type of PPE that we're going to be using in the facility, we should have a PPE program. And this is a written program. It essentially goes through how we're going to select, how we're going to give the employees the PPE, and how they're supposed to use them in what area and that type of thing. And so, as I mentioned, we do need to do that hazard analysis, and that's going to be part of this PPE program. And we have to make sure that we have that certification stating why. And then, of course, we have to train the employee to the PPE, specifically each one of the PPEs that they're going to be utilizing within their job. So employee training, when we start thinking of this, we have to train them with regard to a lot of different things. And these are just some simple, if you can get those in the screen there, just some simple eyewear that you find in any facility. They cost less than $2. So when we provide these to employees, we do need to make sure that we're telling them how to use it properly. We have to make sure that they know when the PPE is necessary, in which area, want to understand what kind of PPE is available and what is necessary. They also have to understand what the limitations of the PPE are. And then the don and doff essentially is on and off, essentially. And of course, we know how to put safety eyewear on, but we do need to make sure we're training to everything else with regard to the other PPE. How to maintain it properly, how to clean it, that type of thing. How do we get a replacement if something happens, if they get scratched or something goes wrong with it. And then how to dispose of the PPE when we look at it. Now we have to do this training, and it does have to be a demonstration, so we have to show the employee exactly what they're supposed to do with the PPE, and then we have to have a written or oral test to certify and verify that the employee understood with regards to that. So we want to watch them put this on and off after we do that, and then we also want to have that written test. I'm going to go ahead and pause this since it's at 10 minutes, and then we'll start back up at the next slide.